No daughter of mine wears that, my mother screamed, her hand flying across my face with a sharp, echoing crack in front of 200 horrified wedding guests. I stood there in shock, clutching my burning cheek as she tore the delicate lace veil from my hair and stormed toward the doors. I believed, standing there humiliated in front of everyone I loved, that this was the worst thing my mother would ever do to me. I had no idea that slap was only the first thread of a secret so much bigger than either of us, one that would not fully unravel until months later, in a courtroom neither of us saw coming, when a woman I had been told was dead for 26 years walked through the doors and looked directly at me for the very first time. My name is Claire Bennett, and at 26 years old, I had spent most of my life believing a daughter's first duty was to obey her mother without question. My mother, Diane, ran our household with a quiet, suffocating kind of control, and for years I mistook that grip for overprotective love. Everything changed when I met Derek, a steady Marine Corps pilot who encouraged me to find my own voice. And the moment he proposed by the lake one evening, Diane's controlling nature curdled into something closer to open hostility. The wedding planning became a battlefield almost immediately, especially over my dress, a heavy plain gown Diane had already chosen without asking me. 2 months before the wedding, clearing out my late grandmother's attic, I found a wooden trunk tucked behind old furniture, and inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, sat a breathtaking vintage lace gown unlike anything I had ever seen. When I asked Diane about it that evening, her reaction was strange and violent, her face going pale, insisting it was cursed and that my grandmother's real gown had burned in a fire decades earlier, demanding I leave the trunk locked forever. I took the dress to a seamstress named Nadia instead, who confirmed it was a custom, one-of-a-kind piece from the late 1950s. And while she worked the hem, she paused and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that something small and hard was sewn into the lining near the collar, something that felt like metal. She carefully opened a few stitches and pulled out a tiny brass key, old and tarnished, engraved with a faint set of numbers and the worn logo of a bank that, as far as either of us could tell, no longer existed under that name. Neither of us knew what it opened. I decided not to mention the key to Diane at all, and quietly, without telling anyone but Derek, I chose the vintage dress for my wedding day, the key sewn carefully back into a small pocket I had Nadia add beneath the sash. The morning of the wedding was bright and clear, though a strange nervous energy followed me the entire time I got ready. I walked down the aisle with my eyes on Derek, avoiding the front row where I already knew Diane sat rigid, lips pressed white, watching me the second she recognized the dress. I assumed she would keep her composure in front of 200 guests. I was completely wrong. During the reception, the room went quiet as the sound of her heels echoed across the hardwood floor. Her face flushed dark red, her hands trembling as she marched straight toward us. "Mother? What is wrong?" I asked, stepping back. She grabbed the front of my dress with wild, unhinged eyes and screamed the words that would echo through that hall for years. "No daughter of mine wears that," before her hand cracked across my face hard enough to snap my head sideways. She tore the veil from my hair, threw it down, and stomped on it, spitting that I was an ungrateful monster. Derek stepped between us, and for one terrifying second I watched his hands shake. His jaw locked so tight I thought he might actually move toward her, every instinct in him fighting the training that had taught him to stay controlled under pressure. He did not raise his fist. He raised his voice instead, low and hard, telling her she had just assaulted his wife in front of 200 witnesses and a videographer, and that she needed to step back right now before this got any worse for her. Diane looked around at the horrified faces surrounding her and stormed out through the double doors, leaving a ruined wedding behind her. The silence after those doors slammed shut felt suffocating. Derek held me while my body shook, and later, once we were finally alone in our apartment, he sat on the edge of the bed with his hands still trembling slightly, admitting quietly that for one terrible second back there, he had wanted to hurt her, and that scared him more than anything Diane had done. We called the police that night to file the assault report, but it was the brass key stitched into my dress that neither of us could stop thinking about. It took nearly 3 weeks of quiet digging, an old banking historian Nadia knew, a records request through the county, and one very patient bank manager, before we finally traced the key to a small surviving branch that had absorbed the original institution decades earlier, and confirmed it opened a safety deposit box that had gone completely unclaimed for over 25 years. Inside, wrapped in cloth, we found a birth certificate, an adoption decree, and a handful of handwritten journal pages, the name listed under biological mother nothing like Diane at all. It read, Vivian Rose Carter, my grandmother's younger sister, the aunt I had always been told died in a car accident when I was a baby. The journal pages were fragmented, written in a shaking, frightened hand, mentioning a family that had been ashamed of her, a pregnancy hidden from the world, and a promise she said she had been forced to make in order to ever see me grow up safely from a distance. There was also a notarized trust document, an inheritance left to me by Vivian worth over $1 million, accessible on my wedding day, and a note explaining that this exact dress held the key to everything she had been forced to leave behind. It was the first time in my life I understood that my mother's rage at the reception had never been about a dress at all. It had been about a truth she had spent 26 years trying to bury alive. We handed everything to our attorney, who brought in forensic accountants to trace years of financial records, a process that took over 2 slow, grinding months rather than days, subpoenas, bank audits, and interviews stretching quietly through the fall while Diane, out on bail, called me twice trying to explain herself before her lawyer told her to stop. During one of those calls before I hung up, she said something that stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. I gave up my whole 20s raising you, she said, her voice cracking. I told myself the money was owed to me for everything I sacrificed. I was not lying to myself about loving you, Claire. I was lying about everything else. It did not excuse anything. It made her, for one uncomfortable moment, human instead of a monster. It was during those 2 months that our investigator uncovered something that stopped the entire case cold. A discrepancy buried inside Vivian's original death certificate. A filing date that did not match the coroner's records. A signature that traced back not to a medical examiner, but to a family attorney Diane had used decades earlier. Vivian Rose Carter had never died in any accident at all. She had been quietly paid, threatened with losing any future contact with me forever, and pressured into disappearing under a new name in another state, while Diane took permanent custody and control of everything left behind, including money that was never legally hers to take. When our investigator found her, alive in her 60s, living quietly 2 states away, and gently explained who I was, Vivian did not hesitate. She flew in the week before the trial. I will never forget standing in a small hotel lobby and seeing a woman with my exact eyes walk toward me for the first time in my life. Both of us frozen for a moment before she reached out and touched my face like she was checking I was real. That reunion, not the courtroom, was the moment that truly broke something loose in my chest that had been locked for 26 years. The trial, when it finally began months after the wedding, was packed with friends, relatives, and strangers drawn in by rumors. Diane sat at the defense table trying to look like a grieving, misunderstood mother, her hands trembling as she avoided my eyes. Her lawyer opened by framing the slap as an emotional outburst from a stressed parent, dismissing the fraud allegations as family drama. My attorney stood and told the court plainly that what happened at that wedding was not a misunderstanding, it was panic. Because Diane had just watched her entire 26-year deception walk down the aisle, wearing the one dress that could expose it. He played the wedding footage first, the room going dead silent as her hand cracked across my face on the screen, several jurors visibly wincing. Then, without warning to the defense table, he called his final witness, and the courtroom doors opened to let Vivian walk in. Diane went white. She had spent 26 years believing her sister was either dead or too frightened to ever come back, and watching her walk toward the stand alive was, for one moment, more devastating to her than any piece of paper could have been. Under oath, Vivian described being sent away pregnant and ashamed at 19, coerced into signing away her daughter under threat that Diane would make sure she never saw me again if she resisted, and later strong-armed into staying silent for decades under continued financial pressure. My attorney then walked Diane through the financial audits showing over $900,000 pulled from a trust that was never hers, asking her directly whether she had slapped her daughter over a dress or over what that dress was about to expose. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled him. Diane gripped the edge of the witness stand, looked at Vivian, then at me, and the woman who had run my entire life finally collapsed under the weight of it. I was terrified. She sobbed, her voice breaking apart in front of the whole courtroom. I gave up everything raising Claire, and somewhere along the way I convinced myself the money was mine because of it. When I saw her in that dress, I knew it was over, all of it at once. It did not excuse what she did. It simply meant that for the first time in my life, I finally understood the shape of the fear that had controlled our entire household. The judge convicted her of felony assault, grand larceny, and systematic estate fraud, ordering her to sign over her home and remaining assets as restitution, along with a suspended sentence, community service, and a permanent restraining order. In the months that followed, Vivian's trust was fully restored, and Derek and I built something steady out of the wreckage. But the real gift was never the money. It was slow Sunday phone calls with a woman learning how to be my mother for the very first time, decades late but not too late. 2 months after the trial, Derek and I held a second, quieter wedding in a sunlit garden, surrounded only by people who had never once needed to be forgiven for anything. I wore the vintage dress again, fully repaired, this time simply as a piece of my own history rather than a symbol of what had been stolen from me. Diane believed one violent outburst would frighten me back into silence forever. She never imagined that the very dress she was so afraid of would not only expose her theft, but bring back the one person she had spent 26 years convincing the world, and herself, was already gone. If this story stayed with you until the very end, take a moment to think about the truths in your own family that only surface once someone finally stops staying quiet. If this journey meant something to you, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because here on the Revenge Tales, we bring you real stories of betrayal, karma, and the moment someone finally takes their power back, and I will see you in the next story.